Just a few months ago, I did the unthinkable. I became my son's soccer coach. Some of you might have had similar experiences of having to coach or teach or be a part of something like that. What's incredible about this is I know absolutely nothing about soccer. I didn't play soccer in school. I don't, outside of watching a couple of high school games, I know nothing about soccer. And so I walked into these early practices and I realized a couple of things pretty quickly. Number one, preparation is everything. If you don't walk into that practice or into that game prepared, those kids are going to run me over. The second thing I recognized is particularly with the age group that I was working with 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old kids, I don't really need to know a lot about soccer. I can give them a couple of skills, but really what this was about teaching them about life. And that the third thing that I've learned about coaching is that the experience that I receive in investing myself in the life of those children comes back and brings me fulfillment and joy, particularly when I see them succeeding in incredible ways. In the book of Mark, we're moving into a new section this week. We're moving into the second half of chapter 8, and this is a significant shift in what Mark is trying to get us to see. The first 7.5 chapters have been all about who is Jesus, and Mark wants us to see from the very first verse of the book that Jesus is the King, the Anointed One, the Son of God, and that amazingly the people, particularly humans throughout these first chapters, are struggling to understand this. But chapter 8, the middle of chapter 8, starts to shift this a little bit, where finally someone gets that Jesus is really the coming King. Peter gets it, but that Jesus has to confront this. As soon as they start to understand it, he starts to teach them about what this means that he is the King. And this is where the rubber starts to hit the road, and confrontation begins to occur in their understanding and their thoughts. In really the middle of Mark, chapters 8, 9, and 10 are all about this understanding and this questioning of the disciples who understand that Jesus is the King, but what does that mean? To kind of understand what this means is that the Jewish understanding, the disciples' understanding of what the coming King, the Messiah, the Christ, was going to do was that it was going to directly impact the day-to-day lives of ordinary people. Normal people like you and me that lived lives that had children, that had spouses, that had jobs, that had expectations and hopes for a future, that wanted to see their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, that wanted to see their community thriving, that these were people, normal, everyday people, but that their lives were going to drastically change because the anointed King of Israel had come into the world. So this was what their expectation was. Part of the other piece of this expectation was that this normal people's everyday lives was going to change because the powers outside of Israel that were affecting the day-to-day living was going to be toppled. That there would be a political revolution, if you will, and that in particularly in Jesus' day, that the Romans were going to be kicked out of town, and that Jesus was going to come into Jerusalem and set himself up as the King of Israel, and he would get married and have kids so that his children could sit on the throne of Israel forever and ever, as was promised in the scripture. Jesus will confirm that a number of these pieces that the disciples were expecting were correct. Jesus affirms to them that yes, the day-to-day ordinary living of common people was going to change drastically. That the fear of outside oppression was not going to need to be there anymore. The fear of the Roman government was not going to need to be there anymore. And that yes, he would in fact establish a reign that would last forever. Over these next couple of chapters, we're going to be talking about the way that the disciples missed on some of these expectations, though, and that leads us into today's story. In Mark chapter 8, Jesus takes his followers away and he asks them a question, and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And they go, "Who do people say that I am?" And they go through a bunch of different people. And finally, he looks at the disciples and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter speaks on behalf of the disciples and says, "You are the Christ. You are the Messiah, the King." And Jesus immediately starts to teach them that he is going to go to Jerusalem, the capital of the nation, and he's going to be betrayed into the hands of the leaders. He's going to die, and he's going to be raised again to new life. Peter, freaking out over this because this isn't what's supposed to happen. What's supposed to happen is Jesus, as the king, is going to go into Jerusalem, kick the Romans out, the Roman leaders, the Roman military is going to be out of town, and that a new kingdom of Israel is going to be set up with Jesus as king. That this is not the way it's supposed to be. So Peter pulls Jesus aside and starts to tell him, look, this isn't going to happen to you. It can't happen to you. And that Jesus looks at Peter and looks at the rest of his followers and immediately rebukes Peter and says, no, you're not thinking like God, but you're thinking man's thoughts, human thoughts. And then Jesus teaches this incredible statement. And he says this, he says, if anyone would follow me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. You see, this issue of day-to-day living is very much a part of our world today. I remember growing up and listening to the band Live from Central Pennsylvania, a famous band, number of hits. But I remember listening to their album, and that one of the songs said that you tell me about this Jesus, how he was full of love and he was strong. But the lyricist says this, he says, but what a man was 2,000 years ago means nothing at all to me today. That was a song that was written just 25, 30 years ago. This is still an idea that we are wrestling with. Is Jesus still relevant? Is he still going to change the common, ordinary lives of ordinary people, the day-to-day living that we have? Or is he just here to make us feel good for a little while, or to make sure we're on the right side of judgment and that we have a nice afterlife? Is Jesus really important to my day-to-day living? And we all have different answers to that question, but that Jesus presses in his teaching to Peter, because what Peter is getting at is he's pressing that question. If you are dead, Jesus, it is impossible for the day-to-day living of people in Jerusalem to be changed. If you're not the reigning king sitting on the throne of Jerusalem, it is impossible for the day-to-day lives of the normal people living in Jerusalem to be changed. It can't happen, because you're going to die and the Romans are still going to be in power. So our lives aren't going to change. They're going to be the same. And you see, the lyrics to that Live song that Ed Kowalczyk wrote is really describing the situation that Jesus is dead and he has no influence or power to change the day-to-day living of our lives. Well, Jesus confronts this, and Peter, by that statement that I was just mentioning, that Jesus looks at him and says, if anyone would follow me, you must deny himself daily, take up his cross, and follow me. You see, what Jesus was saying is that, no, my death and my resurrection will change the day-to-day living of people around the world. It will happen, but it's going to happen in a way that, Peter, you do not understand yet. It's a piece that we are still wrestling with, because my guess is that we still live as if Jesus is dead. Jesus is just an additive to our lives. But Jesus teaches us this. In order for the day-to-day life of our world to be changed, it requires us to deny ourselves and to let go of those things that we so cling to, that we want and desire. It's actually really incredible what Jesus is telling us. It's exactly what I was trying to get at with what I've learned about coaching a soccer team, even though I know nothing about soccer. That what I've recognized is that seeing that kid that struggles simply to kick a soccer ball strongly enough to get it across the field, but seeing that kid enjoy themselves on the field and score a goal sends me through the roof. It gives me a joy that I can't understand. And so there's kind of three things I want to focus in on this denying ourselves and taking up our cross. The first one that I want to talk about with you is that when we make the decision to deny ourselves and take up our cross with the intention of changing the day-to-day living of our world, It's going to be hard. Dying to yourself is not easy. Allowing your wants and your desires for the way that your day is supposed to be lived, or the way that your life is supposed to work, is never an easy thing to do. I have an 8-year-old son, and when he gets something in his brain that he wants, it's very, very difficult for him to break it. One of the things that, if we've needed to travel long distances, for example, that one of the things that gets in his mind is he loves to eat at restaurants. And that when he gets focused in his brain that we're on a road trip and that we're going to stop at a restaurant, it is just this incessant questioning. Where are we going to eat for lunch? When are we going to stop? What kinds of things can I get? Now, 2 things happen. Number 1 is either myself or my wife finally look at him and say, you need to stop asking those questions. But secondly, there are times where we simply say, you know what, we pack snacks and we're not going to eat in a restaurant on the drive up or the drive down or wherever we're going. And when we have done that, the whole demeanor of my son changes. From being excited to, I'm going to get to experience a new restaurant, I'm going to eat what I want, maybe I'm going to get to drink a soda, which he doesn't get a whole lot of, and suddenly he's stuck eating Funyuns in the back seat of the van. And that everything in him changes. The way he interacts, the way he talks, the energy in his speech. He might even cry some because his want and his desire has been dashed because we were prepared and packed some snacks rather than stopping at a restaurant on the road. That might seem like a simple kind of childish example, but the reality is that we do that as adults as well. When we don't get what we want, we throw fits. We become terrible twos again. We just learn how to hide it from people a whole lot easier because we know the right things to say and we know how to control our emotion a whole lot better. But the reality is that our heart is still being broken by the fact that we're not getting what we want. But denying ourselves, which is what Jesus said is going to change our world, is going to require that hard work of saying, you know what? I'm going to do away with what my desires are and my wants are so that I can give the best of what I have, the best of my energy to see the people around me and the lives of the people around me benefiting and better. The second thing that we need to recognize is that when we do that hard work of denying ourselves and taking up our cross, is that we will sense a joy and a fulfillment and a contentment that we cannot know otherwise. You know, if my son would get his restaurant experience, he would remember it. He would have a good time for that 45 minutes to an hour that we were in the restaurant. But as soon as he got hungry in the van again, he would be clamoring to go to another restaurant. He wasn't fulfilled by the fact that he went to that restaurant. But when you deny yourself and take up your cross, and that you give yourself over to another, that there is a satisfaction and a fulfillment that floods you, that you learn how to truly rejoice with someone who's rejoicing. It's that experience of a teacher, for example, that spends hours mentoring a student that's struggling in mathematics or history. And that student goes and takes the exam and passes it with flying colors. It's not just the student that rejoices, but the teacher senses a deep fulfillment and joy in seeing the pupil succeed. I believe that changes us. It changes our lives. It changes the way that we live our day-to-day lives. The third piece of this is that we need to remember when we look to deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow Jesus, that we really do influence the people around us when we give ourselves up, our desires over, and live and give our best to others. We change people. They're confused potentially, particularly people that maybe have never really experienced someone who has loved them with the love of God. That people experience this like, what is this crazy thing that you keep doing? What is this thing that you keep giving to me? This attention that you give to me, this ear that you give to me, this forgiveness that you give to me. speak to my own personal life here, and I am indebted to my wife. I didn't grow up in the church. I didn't have any connection with God at all. By the time I was 18 years old, I was an atheist, and I rejected the fact that God loved me entirely. But that through my relationship with my wife, I've come to see a picture of the love of God, and it looks like this. That I might have done things that have hurt her, that have damaged my relationship with her, and yet she never turned away, but rather said, I forgive you, and I'm staying here with you. That type of love is unfathomable. I am so incredibly amazed at the way that my wife continues to love me. But that this is a picture where I go, the only way that this is feasible, the only way that this is possible is the fact that God has given my wife love for me. And that when we give ourselves over like that to people in our world, they will notice. People's lives, the day-to-day way that they live their lives will be changed because Jesus has shown up through you in their lives. This life that God has designed for you really only can be reached by this denying of yourself and taking up of a cross. It's going to require that hard work. It's going to bring a life of fulfillment, and it's going to change the people around you. Peter recognized that the Christ, the King coming into the world, was meant to change everyday lives, the day by day, moment by moment living for people forever. He was right. Jesus had to correct the way that this was going to happen because it was going to happen through laying himself down, his wants and his desires, so that other people may live. The same thing is true today. Every moment you live matters. Every decision that you make matters. Every relationship that you have matters. Each day matters. And so, you will fulfill that purpose of each moment mattering, that day-to-day living mattering, by laying yourself down, your desires, denying yourself, taking up your cross, and following Jesus. Thank you for following along in supporting the mission of Because Everything Matters. If you've been inspired by today's message, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. There is more content coming. Share it with someone that needs to hear that their life matters.